Hi, welcome back to Human Anatomy and Physiology. Today we're covering the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So this is our third lab, and this corresponds to exercise 17 and 18 in your lab manual, the Allen and Harper lab manual. So 17 will be spinal cord, and then 18 will be spinal nerves. Okay, I just want to remind you, you have this terms list, which is posted on Blackboard, and please remember this is our contract. This is what we are expecting you to primarily focus on. This is what quizzes and exams will be primarily based on. Can you identify where these structures are? And can you give a brief explanation of what the function of those structures is? Okay, so let's get started with the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is going to be continuous with the brainstem. So the brainstem is kind of at the very bottom of the brain, and this structure will leave the foramen magnum at the bottom of the skull. So we had the occipital bone, and it had a huge hole in it at the very bottom. That allows the brainstem to exit the skull. Once the brainstem leaves the skull, so once it passes through the foramen magnum, we will now have spinal cord. So right here we can see that foramen magnum. Everything after that will be spinal cord. So spinal cord is running all the way down the vertebral column. If you think back on the axial skeleton lecture, we covered vertebrae. Within those vertebrae, there was the vertebral foramen. So that was the hole inside the center of a vertebrae that will directly house and protect the spinal cord. So that's what we can see right here. These vertebrae have been cut to allow us to see inside of them, and we can see that the spinal cord is running all the way down. There are two enlargements on the spinal cord. There is the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. The reason these are enlarged is because these have extra cell bodies because we have extra cells or extra axons going to and from our upper and lower extremity because we have obviously a ton of muscles and sense receptors in our upper and lower extremity. So these areas of the spinal cord will be a bit thicker. So we have the cervical enlargement in the cervical region and the lumbar enlargement, which is actually in the thoracic region. So I know this is thoracic because we define thoracic as having ribs. So I see all these ribs right here. So for whatever reason, the lumbar enlargement is named the lumbar enlargement despite it being in the thoracic region. Okay, so then the next structure is kind of like the end of the spinal cord. So it's called the conus medullaris. I like to think of the spinal cord as like a pencil or a pen where it's pretty well evenly thick despite those enlargements all the way down until it reaches this tip. So the tip at the very end of the spinal cord kind of looks like a cone. So this is called the conus medullaris, and that's going to be the structure right here. After the conus medullaris, there are all these nerves that are branching out of the spinal cord. Collectively, we call these the cauda equini. So this would translate to horse's tail. So it kind of looks like a tail that's coming off the end of the spinal cord. And then the final structure is not nervous tissue, but it is connective tissue. So it's this reddish structure right here called the filum or filium terminale. So this is kind of like a rubber band that will be holding down our spinal cord with the coccyx, with the very end of the vertebral column. Okay, so let's look at protection now. So protection of the spinal cord. So, well, first let's look at just how to know if you're looking at an anterior or posterior side. So this is a critical step or a critical thing that you have to be able to identify if you want to understand the function of these different components of the spinal cord. So I think the easiest when we're looking at anterior versus posterior is going to be this big dorsal root ganglion. So dorsal, if you think back to our anatomical direction terms, dorsal means back, like the dorsal fin of a dolphin is on the back of the dolphin. So the dorsal root ganglion implies that this structure is a posterior structure. So anytime I'm looking at a spinal cord, I'm looking for this structure to identify posterior. Another convenient structure is this anterior median fissure. So this is a very big slit on the anterior side of the spinal cord. This is much bigger compared to the posterior median sulcus, which will be on the back side. So I highlighted in green the two that I find most convenient to identify, anterior versus posterior. So please try to remember how to identify anterior versus posterior. Okay, so in terms of protection, we already mentioned that we have the vertebral foramen, the bony portion that's going to be surrounding the spinal cord. There are also these protective layers called meninges. So these are color-coded right here. 3 different layers. So the outer layer is called the dura mater. So mater translates to mother. So this would be the durable or tough mother. So the tough protective layer on the outside. The middle layer is called the arachnoid mater. So this is more of a web-like meninge. Kind of looks like a spider web, thus the name arachnoid. Then the final layer, which is directly hugging the spinal cord, is the pia mater, which translates to soft meninge or soft mother. So the pia mater is directly in contact with the spinal cord. Then we have the arachnoid mater. Then we have the dura mater. Okay, a few more structures that are used for protection. There's this layer of tissue called, or this space called the epidural space, which is filled with adipose tissue. So if you've ever heard of an epidural, this is where an anesthetic will be injected during pregnancy into this epidural space, and then that anesthetic will then leak into the spinal cord. So we have this epidural space which is surrounding the vertebrae and providing cushion. It's surrounding the spinal cord and providing cushion for the spinal cord so it's not bumping directly up against the bony vertebrae. Then we have cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is a liquid that's produced in the brain. This is going to bathe the spinal cord and maintain ionic homeostasis. So it's just a solution that's keeping the spinal cord very comfortable, but it's also kind of providing protection where the spinal cord is in a liquid solution, and that will also reduce the tendency of it to slam into the side of the vertebrae. And then the final structure are these little ligaments. So these are called denticulate ligaments. This is connecting pia mater to dura mater. So these are kind of like cables that are holding down a big tower. They're just stabilizing the spinal cord in the center of the vertebral canal. Okay, then we have just general anatomy for the spinal cord. So there's gray and white matter. The first thing you should be able to explain is what is the difference between gray nervous tissue and white nervous tissue. So white nervous tissue is white because it has a layer of myelin around it. So we have axons that become myelinated. So this allows messages to transfer much faster. So anytime we have white matter, that means we have myelinated axons. So these are like highways that allow information to go up and down the spinal cord. Meanwhile, gray matter does not have high concentrations of myelin. This is where we have the actual cell bodies. So this is kind of like the command center for the cell. So anytime we have gray matter, we will have cell bodies. Anytime we have white matter, we will have axons. The naming for this portion is very simple. So for the white matter, we have columns because these are running up and down. So on the posterior side, we have the posterior white column. So I know this is posterior because we have the spinous process on the back of the vertebrae. So this is going to be a posterior feature. And we have the body, which is an anterior feature on the spinal cord, or on the vertebrae. So the spinal cord, posterior white matter, this will be called the posterior white column. If it's on the side, we will have a lateral white column. And if it's on the anterior side, it's going to be the anterior white column. And then for the gray matter, we really have just three horns. So we have a posterior gray horn, a lateral gray horn, and an anterior gray horn. So very simple naming system. One more structure I'd like to highlight, it's called the gray commissure. So it's kind of tough to see right here, but think of this as a connection between the two sides of the spinal cord. So commissure will be axons that are going side to side. So it's not very white right here, but this is going to be kind of like a highway where we have information going from left to right and right to left. So the gray commissure is going to be the connecting point for these cell bodies in the gray matter. This model is showing the posterior side of the torso with many of the muscles and vertebrae removed. So here we can see our spinal cord. So the spinal cord is going to be running along our vertebral column. At the very top, it's not very clear, but this is where the cervical enlargement would be. And then right in this region is where our lumbar enlargement would be. If we trace the spinal cord all the way down to the very end, we reach a tip right here. This will be the conus medullaris. After that, we have all of these individual nerves coming off that look like the tail. So that would be the cauda equini. And then at the very bottom, this would be our filum terminalis. So now we want to look at the structures and features that are used to protect the spinal cord. So the first set of structures are the meninges. So these are layers of tissue that are directly around the spinal cord. The very first layer is the pia mater. This is the layer that's directly on top of our spinal cord. Then we have a space. This is called the subarachnoid space. Then we have a thin structure called the arachnoid mater, directly followed by the dura mater. So in this model, it's difficult to tease apart the dura mater from the arachnoid mater. We also have the epidural space. So this is full of adipose tissue. We have, or at least we would have, denticulate ligaments in this location. So the denticulate ligaments are connecting the pia mater to the dura mater and stabilizing the spinal cord. Then finally, we have regions for cerebrospinal fluid. So first we have the central canal. The central canal will be full of cerebrospinal fluid. And then I also have a structure that I didn't mention in the PowerPoint recording. This is the subarachnoid space. So the subarachnoid space will also be full of cerebrospinal fluid, and that's going to be located in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. We have the spinal cord itself. So at the very front, we have what's called the anterior median fissure. So this is a slit that's much larger than the posterior median sulcus on the back side. Then in the spinal cord, we have white matter and gray matter. The white matter will be the myelinated axons. The gray matter will be the cell bodies. If we're looking at the posterior side, so we know this is posterior because we have a spinous process. So that will be on the back. We have posterior white columns, then lateral white columns, and then anterior white columns. Very similar naming system for the gray horns. We have posterior gray horns, lateral gray horns, and then anterior gray horns. And then these two sets of gray matter are going to be connected to each other through the gray commissure. Okay, so now we're ready to look at the spinal nerves. So we just covered the spinal cord, and now we're looking at how sensory information is going to come into the spinal cord, and motor information will leave the spinal cord and activate skeletal muscles. So in general, ascending information will be going on through the posterior white column, and descending information will be going through the anterior white column. But don't worry too much about the ascending and descending tracts. We are much more interested in these nerve connections. So here we have just the standard spinal cord. Attached to that spinal cord are two types of roots. So there is the anterior or ventral root on the anterior side, because we have our anterior median fissure right here representing the front. Then we have our posterior or dorsal root in the back. So we have our posterior root ganglion, um, representing the posterior side, and then the posterior root going in the back of the spinal cord. So these are two types. So these are both roots. Our anterior root will be just motor information. Our posterior root will be just sensory information. And then the reason we have this dorsal root ganglion is this is where the actual cell bodies will be located for sensory nerves. So our motor cell bodies will be here in the gray matter, and the sensory cell bodies will be in the dorsal root ganglion. So we have these two roots. We have our dorsal root ganglion, and then we have a spinal nerve. So whenever those two fuse together, we get the spinal nerve. But this spinal nerve is very short-lived. So I've highlighted the entire extent of the spinal nerve because right after the spinal nerve, we get these structures called rami. So we have an anterior or ventral ramus, very similar to our anterior root, but ramus means branch. So instead of a root going into the ground, we have a branch coming off the tree trunk. So the anterior ramus will wrap around to the front. Meanwhile, the posterior ramus is going to wrap and innervate the posterior side of the body. So I think this is a really good way to visualize this. I'm going to use this analogy as with a tree. So if you could imagine our spinal cord being kind of like the earth, you have roots going into the earth, very much like you have the roots of the tree going into the earth. Then you have the trunk of the tree, and then you have the branches of the tree. So here I have those structures correlated from the spinal cord to the tree. So starting up here, we have our branches, our anterior ramus and our posterior ramus, and we have the branches of the tree. We have those rami coming together to form the spinal nerve, which is similar to the trunk of a tree. So this is kind of the intermediate between the branches and the roots. And then finally, we have the roots that are going into the ground. And in this case, our roots are going into the spinal cord. So just to demonstrate this, this is the standard patella tendon reflex pathway. So here, the patella tendon gets hit with a mallet that stimulates this yellow cell. This is a stretch receptor cell, so it's sensory information. That sensory information is going to run through this axon, and eventually we have a cell body located in the dorsal root ganglion. So it enters in through the anterior ramus, passes through the spinal nerve, and at the spinal nerve we have a separation of information. Sensory information will be going in the back. Motor information is coming out the anterior root. So the sensory information from the mallet strike will stimulate this cell in our dorsal root ganglion that will continue to send the message through the dorsal root into our gray matter. So it's going to then stimulate the cells in the gray matter. Those cells are now stimulated. These are motor cells. So the motor signal will leave through the ventral or anterior root. So this is just motor information at this point, no sensory information. That motor information goes through the anterior root into the spinal nerve and then out through the anterior ramus. So note at this point, once we reach the spinal nerve, we have both sensory and motor information. Once we hit the anterior ramus, we have, again, sensory and motor information. So the signal will go through the anterior root, spinal nerve, anterior ramus, all the way out to stimulate these muscles. The muscles will contract, resulting in the leg moving. So this is a very clean example just showing how certain parts of this pathway are either mixed information, sensory and motor, or certain parts of the pathway are either sensory or motor information. So there was one more set of rami that I haven't covered yet. So these were not really visible on either of the previous slides. These are called rami communicantes. These are a separate set of rami from the anterior and posterior rami. So here you see our vertebrae stacked on one on top of one another, the spinal cord running up and down along with them. Coming off of the spinal cord, right here it shows what you should be able to see is the anterior and posterior roots coming together to form a spinal nerve. That spinal nerve, seen a little bit better here, will then branch into the anterior ramus, the posterior ramus, but there are also these two anterior rami. So these two anterior rami are communicating or connecting with these structures right here that are running along the vertebrae. So these are called sympathetic chain ganglion. So those can be viewed over here. So these are involved with the fight or flight system, so our sympathetic nervous system. So these two rami are essential for stimulating and communicating with the sympathetic chain ganglion. So this is, again, just fight or flight responses. This way we don't have to send the signal all the way to the brain. We have these little collections of cells right outside the central nervous system that will allow for quick responses instead of sending it all the way to the brain and then having the brain send the message all the way back down the spinal cord. We are now interested in how nerves will be connecting to our spinal cord. So first we need to know if we're looking at the anterior or posterior side. I think the dorsal root ganglion is our best landmark, so this is always going to be on a posterior side. That means this will be the posterior side, this will be the anterior side. The anterior side has the ventral or anterior roots, meanwhile the posterior side has the dorsal or posterior roots, along with the dorsal or posterior root ganglion. Those two roots will come together to form this structure right here, called the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve will then branch into several different branches. We have our posterior ramus, anterior ramus, or the rami communicantes. So there is just motor information on our anterior root. There is just sensory information on our posterior root. There is mixed information on our spinal nerve. And then there is mixed information on our rami. For our rami communicantes, these two will be connecting to the sympathetic chain ganglion, which is found lining our spinal column. Okay, so now we're looking at plexi. So plexi, you can think of these as like, it says right here, like a highway interchange. So you have all these anterior rami coming off of our spinal nerves. Those anterior rami are then going to start to fuse together, like lanes would come together on a highway, and then they will kind of randomly be separating apart. So you'll have anterior rami from different parts of the vertebral column coming together and creating unique nerves. So think of the plexus as just like an interchange. So we have an interchange at the very top called the cervical plexus, and then one that will give rise to nerves that go down the upper extremity called the brachial plexus. So there's only one nerve you need to know that comes from the cervical plexus, so it's kind of hinting at this one right here. This one will be the phrenic nerve. This is going to go down to our diaphragm. So the diaphragm is the essential muscle for breathing. Whenever the diaphragm contracts, that increases the volume inside the lungs, resulting in air coming into the lungs. So just know that the phrenic nerve, this is the nerve coming off the cervical plexus controlling the diaphragm. For the brachial plexus, however, there are quite a few nerves that are coming off of it. So here we have two views to look at this. I think the easiest nerve to identify here is the axillary nerve. So the axillary nerve, this is the nerve that's going through the armpit and staying in the shoulder region. So the axillary nerve will control the deltoid muscle, which is our major shoulder muscle, and it will also receive sensory information in the shoulder region. Then we have the musculocutaneous. So the musculocutaneous is responsible for innervating our bicep brachii. So this is the major muscle used for elbow flexion. It will also innervate the coracobrachialis and the brachialis muscles. Then we have our ulnar, median, and radial nerves. So the median is going to be in between the ulnar and radial nerves. The median will be on the anterior side getting forearm flexors. So this will help you bring your wrist into a 90-degree angle. The ulnar nerve is kind of running along with that, and it's actually going to be even more medial than the median nerve. And this is what is actually responsible for your funny bone. So if you've ever hit your elbow on the corner of a desk, you've hit your ulnar nerve. So this will be running down to the pinky on the median side. And then the final nerve is the radial nerve, which is primarily posterior. So this view is posterior because I can see the scapula and the spine of the scapula with the acromion, suggesting I'm looking at it from the back. So the radial nerve is running down the back of the humerus, so it will stimulate the tricep and receive sensory information on the posterior side of the humerus. And then that nerve, as it goes down, is going to branch into the deep radial nerve, and that deep radial nerve will further branch into the posterior interosseous nerve. So the radial nerve is running down the posterior side, and then it has these two branches coming off of it. One's the deep radial nerve, which is going to be higher or more proximal compared to the supinator muscle. So once the nerve passes the supinator muscle, which will be in this region, it will then become the posterior interosseous nerve. So in general, the radial nerve, in addition to triceps, this nerve will innervate the extensor muscles of the wrist, allowing us to pull our wrist back. Okay, so now to the lower extremity. So here we have our lumbar and sacral plexus. So there are a few nerves coming off the sacral plexus, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But on this slide, we can see our lumbar plexus coming out of the lumbar vertebrae. There are two nerves that we're interested in. There is the obturator nerve. So this nerve will be going through the obturator foramen, which we covered on the os coxa, and this will be innervating our adductors. So these are the muscles that will, when they contract, they pull our legs in close to the midline. Then the other nerve is the femoral nerve. So the femoral nerve is going to run down the front of the femur and innervate the anterior thigh muscles. So this would be like the rectus femoris, vastus medialis, and vastus lateralis, also known as the quadricep muscles. Then we have the sacral plexus. So the sacral plexus is going to be primarily derived from nerves originating from the sacrum. So the sacral plexus is going to give rise to posterior nerves, at least at the start. It gives rise to the pudendal nerve. So the pudendal nerve is going to be important for reproductive structures, so it will stay in the hip region. Then the large muscle that is running down the posterior side of the femur is called the sciatic nerve. So this will innervate the hamstring muscles, so muscles like the semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, and it will also receive sensory information from the posterior thigh. Then the sciatic nerve will branch into two nerves, either the common fibular nerve or the tibial nerve. The tibial nerve is going to remain posterior, so it's going to run down the back side of the tibia. Meanwhile, the common fibular is going to wrap around and innervate muscles on the anterior side of the tibia. So we are now interested in plexi and the nerves that come off the plexi. So I'm going to skip showing you the cervical plexus. We don't really have a model that shows a good phrenic nerve. I'm going to jump straight to our brachial plexus. So the brachial plexus will be starting in this region, and it's going to be giving rise to all the nerves going down our upper extremity. The first one to highlight is going to be right where our deltoid is. So if I pop the deltoid off, this shows this little nerve right here. This will be our axillary nerve, innervating our deltoid, receiving sensory information from the shoulder region. The next muscle to pop off is our bicep brachii. So this is the muscle that's responsible for elbow flexion. When I take this off, this reveals this nerve right here called the musculocutaneous nerve. If we flip around to the back, we have our triceps. These cannot be removed, but the radial nerve will be directly below our triceps here. that nerve is going to pop out right here around the elbow. And then if I remove these posterior extensors, this will show me my deep radial and posterior interosseous nerve. So this would be our deep radial down here. On the anterior side, we have these two nerves right here. So this will be our ulnar nerve, and this will be our median nerve. So if we trace these down, the median nerve is going to run right down the front where our forearm flexors will be, and then the ulnar nerve will be running on the medial side down towards the pinky. At last, we're interested in the nerves coming off the lumbar and sacral plexi. For the lumbar plexus, we have two nerves. We have the obturator nerve and the femoral nerve. For the obturator nerve, the nerve itself is not visible, but the muscles that it innervates are. So these muscles right here are adductors. So they will bring our thigh or our lower extremity closer to the midline. So these muscles will be innervated by the obturator nerve. So the obturator nerve is in this medial region right here. The femoral nerve is present. So if we remove these anterior muscles, so these would be muscles that are our quadriceps on the anterior thigh. And our femoral nerve is this yellow line running right down the anterior side. For the posterior side, we again can't see a nerve. That would be the pudendal nerve, but that would also be in this medial region. We can see our sciatic nerve. So if I remove the hamstrings, our semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and biceps femoris, that reveals this big yellow nerve on the posterior side. This is our sciatic nerve, and our sciatic nerve is going to give rise to two nerves. So right around at the knee joint, we have the differentiation of the tibial nerve, which is going to run down the posterior side, and the femoral nerve, which is going to wrap around to the front and be visible on the front. So the sciatic nerve will give rise to our tibial nerve and wrap around for the common fibular nerve.